Hello everyone and welcome to the webinar today. We're here to present a summary of our research project which looked at the challenges faced by women in accessing public transport as users and also as employees within the sector in 3 city regions: Abuja, Cape Town and Tunis. We have an extensive team that have joined us today from the project team and they will take you through the findings for each country, and we'll have time at the end to answer hopefully all of your questions. Any of the questions that aren't answered today, we will have a record of them, and then we will be able to respond to them in time after the webinar, should that be required. Now there should be a question bubble visible on your screen, and if you click that and write the question in and send that, then we can collect those together. Otherwise, you can type questions into the chat function and they will get passed back to me to bring up at a later stage in this webinar. We'll be keeping a record of attendees. We'll also be recording this session. I should let you know that. And this session, a recording of this session along with the slides will be shared after to everybody that has registered. So plenty of time to go back and have another look at this if you are interested. Without further ado, I'm going to pass on to our first speaker, introducing Gina Porter from Durham University, who was the team lead for this particular project, and she'll be taking you through a summary of the research findings. And over to you, Gina.
Hello. Can we go? Yes, to the next slide. Right. So, good morning, everybody. I'm going to just provide a little background to the action research study and the approach that we have taken in this work. So here are our 3 study cities: Tunis, Abuja, Cape Town. And our focus, I should emphasize here at the start, is the intersection between transport and employment opportunities, livelihoods, for young women who are resident in the peripheries of the 3 cities. Yeah, they're very different cities, but they're all with relatively high employment potential compared to the rest of those specific countries. And they've also all got relatively high youth in migration. So if we go to the peripheries, they're locations where jobs are sparse in general and transport services are poor, but there are lots of young people sitting there hoping to get work. But many of these young people are stranded. If they have a job, it's very likely they're going to make a long, expensive and uncomfortable journey to get to that job. And yes, it's hard for young men, but it's harder still for young women who want to access work. Young women are particularly constrained in employment markets because really the whole transport sector is built around men, around cultures of male automobility. I mean, transport is a male domain very largely, and men set that sort of atmosphere in which women have got to negotiate their journeys, their lives. So we've got this situation then where men are doing the driving, they're very often owning the vehicles, they regulate the loading of the vehicles, they're the mechanics on the street and so on. And this then affects women's potential to use and feel comfortable on public transport. And it also affects their access to jobs in the transport sector. Very few women are visible working in the sector. And this then feeds back on women as transport users. Women go into that public bus or whatever, and there's a male driver, There are lots of men around. Men have been getting them onto the bus, and they feel insecure. If there were more women working in the sector, more visible in the sector, they might feel more confident about those journeys they have to make. Anyway, our objective has been then to try to understand, I suppose, the minutiae of the constraints that women face, and try to help them move towards improving their transport-related skills, and thus improving their employment opportunities as transport users wherever they're looking for employment, whatever sort of employment they're doing, but also as workers in the transport sector. So if we move then to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this slide, this diagram, gives you, I think, some perspective on our approach, which is quite an unusual one for projects working, I suppose, in the transport field. First of all, if we go to the bottom of this diagram, you see recruitment and training of 18 community co-researchers. We had 6 unemployed young women recruited in each of the study cities. We had 3 women recruited from our study site, which was within the city boundary, peripheral, low income, but within the city boundary. And then we had another 3 women recruited from our site, our research site, which was outside the city boundary. This was a site that was city connected. It was a low income neighbourhood where a lot of people were still going into the city, but outside the city boundary. So we recruited these young women as peer researchers, and we gave them a week's training, and they learned all sorts of things: how to do an in-depth interview, how to write a mobility diary, how to do participant observation, in essence, just learning more about the experiences of people in their neighbourhood, the young women's experiences of travel and transport, and thinking, reflecting on their own experiences. So they did in-depth interviews with their friends, with family, with neighbours. They wrote those mobility diaries. They thought about what was happening as they travelled. So they were building this concept of travel experiences in their own home area, but also they were asking other people about their perceptions of transport sector work. None of them were working, they were all unemployed, but some of the people they talked with were working in the transport sector. And certainly a lot of young women had views about the transport sector as a place of work, very often pretty negative views. Anyway, moving on from these peer researchers and their work, through that we established some really key issues that we wanted to explore further. And the academic research sort of followed on. And it also sort of continued in tandem with some of the peer research work too. The academic researchers did more in-depth interviews. Excuse me. They did focus groups with young women, with young girls in school, to find out about their travel experiences, their aspirations in life, and what they thought of transport sector work. The academic researchers did interviews with men on what they thought of women working in the transport sector, which is quite enlightening. And then with transport sector employers about women in the sector, and with women transport workers themselves. So there's quite a substantial set of research then in each of those 3 city regions, first of all in the low-income neighbourhoods, but then extending across the city. And then in the third, the top, the practical interventions, this is where Transaid take over to lead the skills pilot interventions. We had user skills, which were piloted in each city, and some pilots also about improving the skills of women who were already employed in the transport sector, but who were finding it very difficult to get any sort of improvement in their status, in their position in working in the sector. So, and that you're going to hear a lot more about those practical interventions as we go through the webinar. What I would like to finally emphasize is the centrality of the collaborative approach that this project took. In addition to the peer researchers, we had these informal country consultative groups. And here the peer researchers would come with the academic staff and be able to meet with people from the ministries, from NGOs, private sector, local community leaders, unions, and the actual composition varied between countries, but it was a very useful way of trying to shape the project to local needs and perceptions, but also it gave our peer researchers a real opportunity to say what life was really like for them living in these low-income areas, and talk with the city planners, which is very, very valuable where that happened. Unfortunately, of course, COVID came in, and whereas we'd expected to have every 4 to 5 months, we'd expected to have a country consultative group, that wasn't feasible. But again, actually, the fact that we had our peer researchers was crucial to being able to continue with research. Our peer researchers were sitting in their low-income neighbourhoods, unable to move during lockdowns, but this was still, there was still the potential for them to observe how they were getting on and how the people around them were getting along in those situations. Anyway, you will hear much more about this as we go through the webinar. I'm just going to hand over to Emma now to talk about Tunis. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gina. So, hello everybody. I will try and move through the Tunis work as quickly as I can. A little bit of context for Tunis. Back in the 1960s, Tunisia was considered to have, or Tunis was considered to have a pretty well-developed transport infrastructure for an African country. And that was largely because in the post-independence context, the welfarist government or etatist government was willing to put significant public investment into transport. However, since the 1970s, that transport system has deteriorated very significantly, partly because of low investment at a time of progressive economic crisis in the country, partly due to a very poor basic infrastructure where, as the city grew through rapid urbanization, the infrastructure was unable to keep pace with it, and partly because transport didn't feature particularly highly in the planning for the city's growth. As a consequence, apart from the very poor infrastructure overall and deteriorating infrastructure, there's a very high traffic accident rate, a very poor traffic safety record, and very limited connectivity between the different parts of the city. If you go from one of the peripheral areas to another, you pretty much have to go through the center of the city to get there. So it's quite a common picture, I think, for rapidly growing cities in Africa. Shall we move on to the next slide? So our user research came up with some quite significant, we felt very significant findings. The first one was it's important to note that women are particularly dependent on public transport systems in Tunis. Women's car ownership is relatively low, and even when there is a vehicle in the house, it tends to, priority for using it tends to go to the male household members rather than the women. So women use public transport a lot. The transport systems that they use are the buses, which are 80% belong to the public sector bus company, 20% to a limited number of private companies. A light metro system, which you can see here, is a light rail system, which connects some of the city's peripheries to the town centre, but is actually quite limited in where it goes, and is being in the process of being extended at the moment. Collective taxis, which are supposed to take 8 or 9 people, but quite often squeeze in 14 or 15 in a pretty tight and uncomfortable situation, and private taxis, which are regulated by the government, but they evade the regulation in a way through new mobile telephone apps like Bolt, which allow them to not stick to fixed fees, but to raise the amount of money that they can make on any particular journey. Importantly, the number of private taxis is restricted, and so there is always very high competition for the taxis that are available. And it does leave women very dependent on trying to make journeys that comprise different components of this transport system in whatever equation will best get them from A to B, and always managing the time-money equation in their head or calculation in their head. So we found one of the biggest findings was that women's safety is one of their principal concerns when traveling around the city. Apart from very high levels of sexual harassment and gender-based violence on the public transport and in the public space, which is getting worse or has got significantly worse since the 2011 uprising, there is also significant safety concerns that come out of rising petty crime. Buses are regularly held up by young men with knives. Women are mugged on the streets or in public transport. So, and then there is the issue of vehicle safety. Public transport vehicles are deteriorating. The buses frequently travel with no doors on them. The windows are broken. Private taxis are frequently involved in traffic accidents. They don't have seat belts in them. So safety is a major concern. The second major problem for women is simply the lack of availability of transport to get them from where they are to where they want to go. So they're usually having to take multiple routes on multiple different forms of transport, which means a lot of waiting in between stops. It means a lot of calculating how the time is going to be spent. And women spend vast amounts of time on their journeys. And we heard a lot about time poverty, which erodes their opportunities for leisure and also leaves them pretty exhausted. And this combination of time and lack of availability and lack of safety and lack of comfort means that women find transport progressively more and more difficult, and they're choosing to move around the city less and less. And we had this very strong impression of a declining sphere of public mobility for women in Tunis. Another thing that came out very strongly was they didn't know or understand different ways that the transport system is managed. They didn't know who to go to if they wanted to make a complaint or to make suggestions about improvements. And even then, they had very little confidence that if they said something, it would ever be listened to. So there was a real disconnect between the users and the providers, a communications disconnect. There was also, even where there are mechanisms for raising complaints or issues, either about service provision or about safety and sexual harassment, there was a strong feeling that these were redundant. There was nobody at the end of the phone and that nothing would ever come of it. There was no point in making a complaint to the police because nobody would ever do anything about it. So overall, women felt that the public transport system was really not working for them. So shall we move to the next slide, please? So the skills intervention that was provided by TransAid was focused very much on, first of all, informing women from the 2 sites that we were working in, providing an information seminar where they could both meet some wonderful people who worked with us from the public transport sector, but also from local government, to understand more about how transport is organised, how it's planned, and what kind of provisions there are in legislation for protecting women or for allowing them to access their rights and to give them voice in trying to speak back to the providers and the governance mechanisms. So you can see here a photograph. We worked in this case with a local women's NGO who they do a lot of mobilizing and campaigning in their own local area, including around public transport provision. So we worked with them and some of the women who belong to the organization to have this discussion and provide this kind of information, including feedback mechanisms, how they can get their voices heard where it matters. And the second activity was to work with women, particularly to enable them to voice what they felt about the public transport provision. And this led to discussions around putting together a customer services charter, a draft customer services charter, that they could hope or lobby with our assistance to try and get it adopted in some form by key transport providers in the city. And that's ongoing work that I think TransAid are working with. So if we move to the next slide, please. So the employment research was particularly interesting for me, having worked on Tunisia for many years and seen that in legislation, women have very good rights. They have very equal rights. So there are not really formal barriers to entry for women in the transport sector. And yet when we went in, we found a number of features of women's employment that were very notable. The first one is that women are very underrepresented as employees in the transport sector. Probably about a third of the levels of female employment in transport in Europe, still higher than many Arab countries, but still significantly lower both than their counterparts in Europe, but also very significantly lower than male employees. The second was that where women are employed, there's very heavy gender segregation. So, for example, around 40,000 taxi drivers in Tunis. Of them, there are around 100 women. So women are very underrepresented in driving roles. They also provide a very small minority of bus drivers and train drivers and tram drivers in the city. In contrast, they provide the majority of ticket sellers and administrative roles in lower administrative roles in the transport sector. It was also very noticeable that women provided a very small proportion of the management roles in the transport sector, both in the provision of transport, but in the governance of transport. So there was clearly a leaky pipeline as well in terms of women getting promoted into senior management roles, which inevitably impacts the considerations that feed into transport planning in Tunis. So it's very important that more women are supported into taking the kind of management and governance roles that would allow transport to adjust better to women's mobility needs. There was a very strong perception among both men and women that transport is too hard, too rough and too dirty for women, that it's not an appropriate sector for women to work in. This was at odds, so we would frequently find individuals who both on the one hand were very proud of the nation's record in supporting women's emancipation and enabling women to have equal rights to work in the transport sector, among others, and legally to have equal pay. But at the same time, those same individuals said, but transport, you know, it's not really appropriate for women to work on the buses. It's not a nice job for them to have. Particularly because women shouldn't be working in the evenings or at night because they have family obligations that are more important. There was a lot of discussion around whether women should be working in transport because of how they dress, and that if women did work in transport, they should dress very modestly. But if they dressed very modestly, then they came in for a lot of criticism for not dressing femininely. So it was very, very strong cultural rejection of women working in the transport sector, which could also feed into some of the employment, the informal discrimination in employment. So, for example, for women to drive a taxi, they have to have almost an apprenticeship period accompanying a male taxi driver. But male taxi drivers were reluctant to take female counterparts on because they felt it was compromising for everyone's reputations and potentially quite socially difficult to do. So in general, the problem was these informal barriers to entry, not formal barriers to entry. And again, there was a perception that since 2011, this has been becoming progressively more the case for women, not least because transport was seen to be less safe and that women were being exposed to a progressively less safe environment. Lots of interviewees commented on women not being tough enough to cope with male fare dodgers, to cope with young men coming on the buses or the trains with knives to rob passengers, and that really it wasn't a safe space for women to work in. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. When we looked at the employment skills intervention, this very much focused on trying to support women in management to get ahead, to be able to develop their skills and their competencies, to feel confident, to put themselves forward for promotion, put themselves forward for senior jobs. This particular intervention, I think, was very heavily impacted by COVID. It was, Sam might want to correct me, I think this was the first of the employment skills interventions that we put on. And because of COVID, we moved it to a hybrid format where, to begin with, a large part of it was delivered virtually, which is very difficult because the women who came onto the course did not necessarily have the technical equipment to follow this virtually. We were reliant on being able to bring them under COVID secure conditions to a central location to access delivery online, which you can see here on the screen. We also found that the women were not provided with a very supportive infrastructure at home, so that it was quite hard for them to take time to come in and join the training because they got no compensation for it and little recognition for it. So it was a difficult one to run, but I think, and had quite limited numbers. But I think at the same time, if anyone wants to talk about Ed, who delivered a lot of the online training, for the individuals who participated, it was extremely rewarding and very satisfying to do. And this was basically transport management system training to enhance their actual skills of managing a transport system in place. I think that's probably all I would say for Tunisia. So there's no more slides, so we can move over to Fatima, please. Oh, sorry, we've got to do challenges and recommendations. I forgot about that one. So challenges, definitely the challenges was the COVID restrictions, which also impacted. We had to wait in Tunis quite late in the day to be able to run the in-person user training as well. And it was quite strict and quite strictly enforced in Tunis as well. Also worth noting, throughout all of this period, we've been impacted by very high political uncertainty in the political situation, with governments changing, ministers changing, and institutions being very reluctant to commit to our project in any significant way, because they never knew if they'd still be in their job next week. So that made this very difficult to run. And also to point out that because of the serious underfunding of public transport, either public or private in Tunis, and the uncertain situation of things like privatization, there is very little room to maneuver for the transport providers in Tunisia. They just don't have the resources to resolve a lot of the problems facing women. And in terms of going forward, where we're looking for, it's very clear that there is room for additional training to support women working in the transport sector. Not just the transport management system training, but also some women interviewees did express appreciation of things like how to manage safety and security issues on buses and trains when they were working there. And secondly, to continue to advocate for the adoption of a customer service charter by the main transport service providers, including Trans2, but also not just for that itself, but to try and change the culture to enable women to be more vocal, and for those voices to be heard and actually feed into the delivery process, the planning and delivery process. Thank you very much, and let's move over to Fatima, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to share the Abuja experience we've had from the Tunisia. Now it's Abuja. There are some similarities and there are some differences. And just like Tunisia, we have the users angle of the research, and we have also the employers angle of the research. So I'm going to start with the user and our findings. But a quick one, just like highlighted by Gina, Abuja is a new city, and all the system, there wasn't transport planning for the periphery. And so young women and men who are living in the periphery, it's very expensive for them to get access to the place of work and to the market. Also importantly, it's also the way in which it is costly. It is costly for them. And so it is the challenges, is within these employment challenges that women found themselves. So I will go with the outcome, with the user research in terms of our findings. There are a lot of discrimination against women using public transport. The government buses, they don't go to the periphery. And so that's what makes it doubly expensive and difficult for women. So they have to use the private public transport system. And also, and so for example, when we say discrimination, for example, if they are holding babies and they are carrying load, in fact, the transport drivers, they don't want to stop for women, for example. Or if women are in the vehicle, they don't want to take, men don't want to enter. And so once they have men, the drivers don't even stop for women. So a lot of discrimination, the way in which women have access to the public transport. One critical issue also complained bitterly by the women was the issue of security, especially in the night. There is a lot of theft, a lot of fear of kidnapping. In fact, the issue of kidnapping becomes even more pronounced now than before. Also, there is gender-based violence, the way in which they are inappropriately touched, abused, emotionally abused as well. So all of that, they complain bitterly about it. The security personnel available, it's normally the vigilante that are mostly available. Vehicle don't allow them to carry loads. They think women transport users are a nuisance. It's something they don't like. So the issue of the transport fees became really more serious during the COVID and beyond COVID, because with the COVID, with the restriction put about you can't take more than 3 in a, you have to give space. Of course, then the drivers double the prices, and up to now the prices did not go down, despite the fact that they are still being congested, being put in one place. There is also the issue of road problem of poor road and overcrowding in the vehicle. Next. So in terms of intervention, I cannot see that. Yeah, in terms of intervention, we have a workshop in the 2 neighborhoods of our research. We had discussion where bring women together to discuss some of the issues around their rights using the public transport. Because there is a lot of misunderstanding around that, and so that's really, we felt the need to really sensitize the women on their rights in the transport sector, as well as discuss with them the challenges. So we even brought together the transport unions, the transport owners, to discuss these challenges women face, in order to see how we can really address the challenges. So there was not increasing awareness about those challenges, both by the transport providers as well as by the transport users. We also, through that discussion, we developed what we call the customer service charter by identifying areas of challenges and how each of the stakeholders can really help to provide to improve the situation. Next. So what are the findings in terms of users' interventions? These are the different challenges, and this is what we're discussing. You can see the picture there. There is the issue of vehicle suddenly, vehicle maintenance, vehicles stopping on the road. There is the issue of, I've mentioned about harassment. I have mentioned about reckless driving. This is really a very serious issue for the women. Overspeeding, and some of them under the influence of drugs and all of that. There is also the issue of theft. And these were all the issues identified that needs to be addressed under the customer service charter. Next. So we're going to the this is one of the examples. We even developed a video on road safety. This is the example we have, and I will definitely share it widely for people to see. It's really useful, not only for Nigeria, but also for other African countries. Next. So in terms of employment, this is our findings. We find out that there is massive underrepresentation of women in the sector. There is a lot of those who are engaged in the business. This really they feel discriminated. They are at the lowest paid transport. They are employed as porters, cleaners, ticket sellers. We have very few women taxis. The interesting thing is with the Uber, the Bolt, with all this online, increasingly women are going into that business. But then they encounter a lot of challenges in terms of harassment. They are being harassed that, look, why are you in this space? This space is for men, not for women. Some of them, in fact, been insulted. They will never allow my wife to become a driver. Even for them to load is an issue. Some of them, in fact, even experience physical attack for being in a space that is considered men. And so, but importantly, is the ways that women, more and more women are going into the transport sector. We also have, I mean, as drivers, we also have some women also giving out some of the tricycle and motorcycle hire to some men to drive, and they make income out of it. Next. So what our approach in this direction? Importantly for us, we found a partner, the Abuja Urban Mass Transit Company, who provide the buses for the teeming population in Abuja, and we established very good rapport and relationship. And they're really looking for women, in fact, drivers that can drive their buses. They give priority in the employment of women. And they have a huge number of women in the sector, in their company. But then, so we really engaged with them and provided training for them on transport management in terms of, in fact, in such a way that to enable them really progress within the system. And so they were given around transport management in the area of HR and recruitment, policy and SOP, agreeing on some key performance indicators and fleet management. And this is the first time women in that sector were able to benefit from this kind of training. And they were so pleased and happy with it. Next. So these are the findings and the intervention provided. So we have some few recommendations to give. Of course, it's more than that, but this we want to share with you some of the recommendations we have. There is definitely the need to really sensitize those in the transport sector about women's rights in accessing public transport. In fact, in accessing transport, and come up with some strategies on how to do that. This is something actually we've started discussing with the Federal Ministry of Federal Ministry of Transport with Women Affairs on how to really ensure that women and gender issues and even issue of disability are really integrated mainstream into the whole transport sector. We're also going to work with the transport unions. Transport unions really dominates the public transport system, because even people they still go and register with the union. So we are also the need for also to engage with the transport union to do that. We also, as we mentioned about overcrowding, there is the need to really ensure enforcement of the capacity, minimum vehicle capacity, and the need for the drivers to really demand for that. That's extremely difficult because the vehicles are not enough. It's not enough. The same thing even for motorcycles and the tricycle, it's also overcrowded. But it was enforced during COVID, but I think that was relaxed, as I've said. So there is the need to do that. One thing we also realized was that women do not have anywhere to report for any complaint they have. And so there is the need, even though they have in some of the buses, for example, and they have some telephone number to contact. That is if you lost something, but not if you have complaint. And this is all part of the rights sensitization we've done in the two research areas. So we are working with the union and the companies to have contact numbers so that women and general public can contact if they have any problem. As I've said lastly, is that women are into buying Okadas, that is the tricycle and bicycle, and giving it out. A lot of women in the periphery are involved in that business. And we felt the need also to get them formalize themselves into group for them to be able to access some of the opportunities, grant opportunities that do come up through government, because government only recognize and provide such support to organizations that are registered. And I think we're also working on the need for that to happen. Thank you. I will hand it over to Shadi to continue with the discussion.
Thank you, Fatima, and hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I'm Shadi Ambrosini, a project officer at Transaid, and I've had the pleasure of leading the practical interventions in the Cape Town City region as part of this project. So in Cape Town, we worked closely with the minibus taxi industry, which is regulated by the South African National Taxi Council and is a critical pillar of the South African public transport sector. This mode of transport is in fact the most available in Cape Town, both for short and medium distance trips in urban environments, as well as for rural and intercity transport. Women who frequently commute via the minibus taxi for employment, education, health seeking, etc., are widely discriminated against with regard to their access and use of public transport. And for young women residing in low-income peripheral areas, as we know, the day-to-day travel-related challenges are even more substantial. So the minibus taxi industry, we know, experiences many challenges and is characterized by great tension and violence between associations operating in similar areas, which uniquely have led to an increasing influx of women into the industry. And many of the women who enter the sector do so through the inheritance of operating licenses and business permits from deceased spouses or family members. In spite of this, though, many of these women continue to experience impediments as employees in this industry, where they only make up about 2% of the workforce. And this is partly due to a lack of direct support from associations in the transition stage and transfer of permits and licenses, which means that many women operate illegally or are allocated less busy routes, which has a knock-on effect on their earning potential. So with a clearer understanding of the local context and the challenges that affect women's mobility and employment, we designed a series of practical interventions which engaged with both women as commuters and employees in the minibus taxi industry. And these activities, I should mention, were enabled by a really strong partnership that Transaid established with the South African women's rights organization Sonke Gender Justice, as well as the Women's Desk at Santaco, which was created as a platform with the strategic objective to foster empowerment initiatives for the enhancement of women in the taxi business. Next slide, please. So like in the other city regions, the first practical intervention that we delivered targeted female commuters from the 2 study neighborhoods, where the project team delivered 2 half-day workshops with a total of 36 participants, which included 2 main activities. One activity with the aim of raising the awareness of participants about legislation relating to transport use, which protects the rights of women. Then gender-based violence awareness raising with elements of active bystander training and a focus on reporting and complaints mechanisms, especially related to reporting gender-based violence. Then we had a second activity with the aim of supporting young women to play a more active role in influencing transport services in their city by collaboratively brainstorming solutions that would advise the development of a safe taxi charter for transport providers to adopt. And the Safe Taxi Charter is effectively a pledge from transport providers to their customers, ensuring the delivery of an inclusive service which addresses the challenges identified by the workshop participants. So drawing on previous research findings to guide these group exercises, the user skills interventions only reinforced what was highlighted through the peer and academic research outputs. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we found that threats to women's safety range from verbal harassment to robbery, kidnap and rape, and effective and reliable reporting mechanisms are largely absent, which heighten the frequency and severity of these issues. So we have seen that 3 key themes emerge from the discussions relating to the participants' primary concerns when traveling. As an initial sort of key theme, an overwhelming majority reported concerns for their personal safety, mentioning issues such as space invasion due to overcrowding, harassment, as well as frequent theft of personal belongings. And COVID-19 was also a great safety concern, as commuters reported feeling unsafe by the prevalent lack of mask wearing and social distancing. Secondly, we identified road safety concerns, and these were expressed greatly during the workshop, mainly due to driver behavior, including speeding and reckless driving. Poor vehicle conditions and unsafe waiting areas were also mentioned as part of road safety concerns. And given the often long distances to the city center and the decreased number of stops available, many commuters reported also long walks and wait times at their transport pickup points, which are often with no shelter from traffic, which increase in turn their susceptibility to crime and violence. And finally, a major area of improvement identified by workshop participants was customer service, with contributing factors predominantly including poor cleanliness of vehicles, rudeness and vulgarity of drivers and operators towards commuters. Next slide, please. So now we're on to the employment skills interventions. During phase 1 of implementation, alongside the user skills interventions, we also began to engage with women employed or with aspirations of being employed in the minibus taxi industry. And this was done with a similar approach to the user skills workshops, but in the form of a continuous 2-day workshop engaging with the same group of 20 women. The workshop on both days was co-facilitated by the Women's Desk at Santaco, by Transaid, Sonke Gender Justice, and a research assistant from the University of Cape Town. And its aim was to further understand the challenges and needs of women working in the sector, including drivers, operators, administrators, executive members of associations. And all of this was done in order to identify opportunities to support women's progression and visibility within the sector. So participants during this time were also prompted to reflect on how to support the protection of women's safety in transport, and further discussions with the group over the 2 days also helped us identify their training interest, which allowed us to inform the development of appropriate further skills development training activities. Next slide, please. So onto the findings from these activities. We conducted a baseline survey at the beginning of these activities, which indicated, and the findings of this survey indicated that while there is a desire for roles which involve managerial duties, such as transport supervisor or transport manager, the reality is that there are very scarce opportunities for career development and low prospects of promotions in the sector, which only exacerbate the already lacking representation of women in leadership roles. In fact, a key barrier to women's professional development in the sector was attributed to a lack of training and skills development opportunities. And through further dialogue, the workshop participants expressed an interest in receiving road safety specific training, increasing their knowledge of the process of obtaining licenses and permits, as well as a desire for opportunities to learn from other women in the sector. And this was a crucial point which was raised when discussing how the widespread violence between associations has had a severe knock-on effect on the women who then enter the minibus taxi industry with little to no tools and knowledge on how to navigate such a challenging and male-dominated environment. Next slide, please. So onto the approach of the follow-on employment skills interventions. The project team delivered a series of follow-on training activities between February and March 2022, which consisted of a bespoke training package specifically designed to provide women in transport with training opportunities relevant to their current work, as well as for their desired role within the sector. And these activities included a follow-on gender-based violence awareness session facilitated again by Sonke Gender Justice, a series of discussion-based sessions focused on sharing crucial information on licensing processes and business operation, as well as developing a supportive community of practice for women in the sector. We had a full day of first aid training with learning modules chosen for their relevance to the minibus taxi industry and associated injuries on the road. And finally, we had a focused road safety training, which included driving philosophy and defensive driving, basic mechanical principles, customer care, road signs, signals, and markings. And we concluded the training with a group discussion where the participants had the opportunity to provide feedback to the project team and began making plans for continued engagement with the group. A small group of participants, which have strong links to the women's desk at Santaco, also agreed to keep the group engaged and up to date on prospective training opportunities, which we thought was really positive. Next slide, please. So I think this is quite unique compared to the other city regions where we worked in. So in parallel to the training activities that I just talked about, we also engaged with male drivers at a major transport hub in Cape Town. And based on the previous experience of our partners of working within the minibus industry to address gender-based violence, we designed a practical intervention to further sensitize male drivers on gender-based violence. And we did this during a series of 1 hour long sessions where we reached about 45 drivers operating on selected routes and raised their awareness on how gender-based violence impedes women's mobility via public transport and encouraged them to discuss ways to tackle the attitudes which perpetuate this violence. The delivery of this activity was complemented by the rollout of a succinct and context-specific safe taxi charter, which concisely states the rights of commuters, the responsibilities of the transport provider, as well as crucial information for the reporting of gender-based violence. And I think this activities was quite successful in that we managed to engage with a good number of drivers, some of whom attended more than once and committed to act as safe ride ambassadors on the routes which they operate on. Next slide, please. So the project concluded in March 2022 with the final country consultative group, which we held in Cape Town, and convened partners and teams from all 3 countries involved in the project. And this was a really great opportunity for knowledge sharing and discussion on the impact and success of the activities implemented to date. And also a forum where the project team also communicated the identified key areas of improvement, which can be summarized in the following points. First and foremost, increasing women's visibility in the sector, including through the identification of opportunities to continue capacity building. Secondly, supporting further professionalization of the sector, including through the scale up of gender-based violence awareness interventions. And finally, by improving commuters' safety and confidence when traveling by the minibus taxis. So yeah, that's the end of the summary of the practical interventions we delivered in Cape Town, and I'll hand over to Gina for some final reflections. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Shadi. So I suppose, well, I hope we've shown you the potential of a collaborative partnership like this, bringing together community peer researchers, the communities, academic researchers, and Transaid, plus in each country, those individual local NGOs working together and trying to move things forward. And clearly, and I'm sure everybody on this webinar, attending this webinar, knows it's not easy. And of course, COVID made things even harder. But really, if you really want to unpick what's happening in these low-income neighbourhoods, I think that community collaboration is absolutely key. And of course, it was especially key for us because of the COVID issue. In our academic, researchers were moving, we were engaging between UK and Nigeria, South Africa, Tunis. Again, it became pretty difficult during COVID because from UK we couldn't go out to do field work anymore with our local partners. But in each country we had a senior partner who was mentoring an early career researcher. Again, it was all building a sort of collaborative group where people supported one another. And then the country consultative groups were there all the time as a sort of sounding board. So I suppose in terms of what came out of the work and what you can see from these webinar presentations for Tunis, Abuja, Cape Town, is the way that patriarchal cultures do intersect with transport deficiencies to deny women and girls safe, convenient travel in those low-income study neighbourhoods. And that fear and time-based exclusions really do reduce women's access to transport, whether they're users or whether they're sector employees. And there are far-reaching impacts on well-being. Really, skills building is crucial for women in the sector and just women trying to move around the city. If you know how to go about getting your complaint heard, it can make things at least start to move forward a bit. But obviously, improved security is so essential, and reducing female harassment. So as Shadi said at the end, you've got to deal with men. It's no good just engaging with women and their transport issues. This structural inequality is a relational issue. If we don't work with men, it will be very difficult to move things forward. And so it's so crucial to move on that component, but it is difficult. I suppose, finally, I should say that, of course, these are only pilots. And it's going to take time to improve things in each of these cities. And COVID did make things difficult. to even run the pilots. But hopefully over time, some benefit will accrue in each of those communities where we worked. And hopefully we'll be able to move forward and do more work. It's been a very productive combination, I think, of working academic with the NGO sector, with people on the ground, with the transport companies, with the ministries, and so on. So, and I think I'll leave it there. I think Sam wants to finish, and then we can move to the questions. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you, Shadi. Thank you, Fatima, and thank you, Emma. That was really good. We're now going to enter the question and answer sort of phase of the webinar. And your questions have been coming in thick and fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the questions. I'm going to distribute them to the project team so that they can respond, and where possible for me to respond as well. And the first one, I'm going to go to you, Emma. You're our resident Tunisian expert. And while this question sort of stretches beyond the scope, maybe you could give your thoughts a little bit. But the question is, do the issues in Tunis that you mentioned, the findings from the research, do they apply, or would you imagine that they apply elsewhere in Tunisia?
Okay, thank you. Tunis itself is obviously it's the largest city in Tunisia, and it has particular issues related to the size of the city, the rapid urbanization, the massive movement of population in, the lack of planning. But actually, the problem for Tunisia is the lack of connectivity. The other problem is the lack of connectivity between the capital city and the cities on the coastal area with the interior of the country, which is really very poorly provided for with transport. There's very little transport between rural areas. You have to go back into the city or to the coastal area, and that provision itself is very, very limited. A lot of the international investment, the international assistance, so money from the World Bank, for example, that is going into Tunisia, is going into developing the travel corridors between the rural areas and the city. But it's going to be very hard for them to provide sufficient transport connectivity. And it's not just the roads that are missing, it's the actual vehicles for delivering transport connectivity as well, which is really insufficient. So I would say there are particular problems with being a very dense urban area, which is very poorly provided for, but there are similar problems for other parts of the country. And the sexual harassment issue is that's across the country. The idea that transport is too rough, too hard, too dirty for women. You would have even fewer women working in the transport sector outside of the city. Even within the city, there are some areas where it is more okay, and some areas where our respondents were telling us men do not like to see women, even as ticket collectors. They don't like to see women drivers. They don't want to get into a taxi which is driven by a woman. So there's a big differentiation in terms of that across the country, but the overall influence of patriarchal norms, as Gina says, is very heavy nationally.
Thank you, Emma. That was great. Next question is to you, Fatima. You mentioned the motorcycle safety films that were part of this project. The question is, what was the response to the motorcycle safety films from the women? I know we sort of had a premiere evening where we showed the films to the target communities. What was the response to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. We premiere the film in our 2 locations, and after that, because mark you, there were a lot of also local content that goes into the film. So it was well received because of the safety information, the way it is. So it's well received, and we're trying to see how it can be widely used, put into WhatsApp, etc. So widely used, and it's local content in it, so that makes it doubly useful. Yeah. Did you hear me?
Yes, I think so, Fatima. Yes, we did. Thank you very much for that. And the next question actually goes on from this a little bit, actually. It's a question from somebody asking whether there are any resources that can be shared. Of course, the motorcycle films can be shared. We will share the links to those. They're actually uploaded onto YouTube at the moment. So we are closely monitoring the views on them. And obviously, we would appreciate any support in disseminating that information to your networks as well. We have a published journal article as well, which we can make available. And you can see there are other journal articles underway in terms of sort of future publication. And you can see on the slide, which is currently visible, we have a project website upon which many of the summaries of many of the reports that we've produced as part of this program are available to view and to read. And of course, you have our contact details there as well, which we are more than happy to receive requests for information at other points. The next question. Right, the presenters stressed that women in cities are often time poor. How is the experience of inviting women to participating in the training? And this question specifically relates to Cape Town, so I'm going to pass that to you, Shadi. What was the experience of bringing the women into the training to participate?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for the question. So I think, as always, we're very conscious of the time and effort that it takes, particularly for women to be away from their jobs. And so what we always try to do is try to create sort of incentives for them, as well as the outcomes of the training. But what we found was actually there was such a great appetite for the activities that we delivered. We originally were meant to target 2 separate groups of women in Cape Town, and we ended up delivering a longer version of sort of the workshop over 2 days to the same group because of their keen interest in what we were doing. And we found through discussions that they really appreciated the forum in which they could meet and engage with other women working within the sector, which is something that they didn't necessarily have a lot of opportunities for. And so I think that tangible and intangible incentives that were presented through this opportunity really made it a valuable experience and worthwhile experience for the women in Cape Town. And I think that it showed in the follow-up that we had in terms of the engagement with the follow-on employment skills activities and the engagement that we had through those. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
Thank you, Shadi. I should say also that in Abuja, the participation levels in the employment skills training was very impressive as well. And that was through the link with the Abuja Urban Mass Transit Company. I believe Mr. Yukubu might be with us today. But there was some really strong support for the training from senior management and some real buy-in, and actually many of the senior managers attended the full training there as well. So hopefully that answers the question. Thank you very much for that. Gina, there's one for you. Interesting to see a research project with a practical intervention. That we need more of this. How did this work contrast to a pure research project?
Wow. I think it's just so much more satisfying, because I think if you're going in to just do research, you can, you know, you can never promise anything. You have to sort of say, we will engage with the relevant people, we will disseminate what you're saying, but that's it. And it's been fantastic to have Transaid looking at our findings, thinking what, you know, the sort of debates about what we should do, what we could do. Okay, limited resources, but hopefully, you know, there is an opportunity to push all of this forward even further. I think we feel more confident. I think the peer research component, of course, is always means that it's more than just an academic project anyway, because you train people who then they use the skills they've got. We sort of gave certificates and so on, and a lot of our peer researchers in this and some earlier projects I've done have used that to get jobs. So there's even been a practical element there. But to really then try out these things, I think we just need people to now come in and support this work further, so that we can build on it, I suppose, even further. But I hope that there will be more work of this that's funded in this way. I suppose perhaps there's a bit of nervousness, but this was funded under a GCRF skills and education program. So we were able to really push that we needed to do the actual intervention work. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gina. The next question is Uganda part of this process? Women are in hell. The short answer is no, that Uganda was not part of the 3-country study that we performed as part of this project. But actually, TransAid have a long history of work in Uganda, and we're well aware of the situation there in terms of public transport and access for female users, and in many countries likewise. And I think one thing this project sort of opened our eyes to was the fact that it could be scaled and implemented in other countries, and that's certainly something that we're investigating, as Gina just alluded to, other opportunities to replicate and scale and adjust and adapt this work to other contexts. So hopefully we shall make it to Uganda as well in the near future. Shelley, I have another quick question for you. The intervention in Cape Town is particularly interesting to me, and this actually links to what I've just mentioned actually. What is the scope to grow this work in Cape Town? Understanding, of course, as Gina's emphasised so far, really they're just pilot projects, but is there scope to expand that project in Cape Town?
I think there is. I think there's huge potential. I think the engagement that we've seen from our partners, the partnerships that we've built with local organizations as well, as Gina mentioned, the work that we've done with men and seeing the response to that on the taxi ranks in raising awareness on gender-based violence, but also communicating those key messages of customer service. I think that we've learned through the implementation that there are some existing pilots, some government funded, that particularly relate to addressing road safety concerns such as speeding, driver behavior, etc. But one of the key elements that was always sort of missing in what we understood was that element of customer care, of gender sensitivity in the planning and delivery of transport services. And so I think that if we're able to sort of bridge that link and make that connection, sort of bring some of these elements into potentially some existing frameworks, or building onto what we've been delivering, I think that there is absolutely huge potential for that. There are enormous efforts from the women within the Santaco structure as well to reclaim more space and become more involved in the leadership and the sort of the decision-making processes and how the industry is run and the industry functions. And so I think there is definitely a lot of potential there to continue to support them, to continue to try and make some of the strategic pillars that they have developed a reality. Yeah, I don't want to say too much on that, but I think there is huge potential. Yeah.
Thank you, Shelley. Completely agree. Gina, there's a question specifically requiring your response. So, the decolonisation of ESRC and transport research and contributing to that is great to see as part of this methodology. As I mentioned, this is specifically for Gina. Why is it so hard to make this change? You've been working in gender and transport issues for maybe 2 or 3 decades now. Is there something we're not doing that we should be?
Wow. Gosh. I think maybe Priyanthi Fernando is on this webinar. It's thanks to Priyanthi that I first got some contacts to an Indian NGO which was working with child labour and working with children as researchers. And Priyanthi put me in contact with them, and through that I started to work with peer researchers. And I think that's really key to this whole thing of decolonizing transport research. I don't see, if you're just going in at a top level and talking with policymakers, it's ever going to move things really forward on the ground. But why it's, just to get funding to do this sort of work it is so hard. We just had this amazing opportunity that there was a call for skills and employment, and I saw this and thought, well, why can't we? Perhaps it will be more open now. Perhaps there will be more opportunities to do this kind of thing. Tim Schwanen wrote a very nice piece for a publisher a couple of years ago, saying, if you really want to decolonize transport research, it's going to be a massive job. And essentially, it's got to move things to universities in the South. We can't do it from universities in UK and the States and so on. Having said that, I think if we work in collaboration, it's very exciting. Because we can, I think a lot has come out in this project just through that sort of sparking one another off with ideas, and that's come right across through all the people involved. We've got 40 people essentially on this project. There were 18 peer researchers, but there are more than 20, I think, actual then with Transaid and the universities and their RAs. When we've trained, hopefully some of those young people we've trained not just as peer researchers but as RAs will go on and work in this field from Tunisia, from Nigeria, from South Africa, and take things forward. So yeah, but I think it's still a challenge.
Thank you, Dina. Question for you, Shadi. Gina mentioned the importance of involving men as part of this process. What was, as Cape Town was probably the most sort of prominent example where we visibly sort of brought men into the fold there, particularly with the GBV training. What was their response to the training? How did they react to it?
Thank you for the question. So I should say we began engaging with men at 2 different stages. The first stage as we were delivering the user skills intervention, and that was kind of a taster to see how their response would have been. We did that in a sort of more informal settings on a really busy taxi rank in the periphery of Cape Town. And I think that the response was a little bit mixed. There was some hesitance in the content that we were trying to talk about, as obviously it was very sensitive, talking about harassment, gender-based violence issues, consent, etc. So I think that the response kind of matched the context in which we were delivering the intervention. But then we saw a much more a much more interest and positive response in the second time round that we delivered this intervention. So alongside the employment skills at the end of the project, and we did this in a little bit of a more structured setting. We were able to build some partnerships with officials working within the taxi ranks, working with these drivers who were able to recruit them alongside us, who were able to communicate in more detail the message that we were trying to pass on, and the aim of the activities. And so, like I said, we had quite an interesting turnout. Some drivers maybe attended more than once, and we actually saw that quite a positive thing, as we were able to to emphasize a little bit more some of the key concepts that we were trying to communicate. And we saw actually there was quite a positive initial behavior shift in terms of their participation, but also in terms of their willingness to go back and communicate with some more of their colleagues about what they were learning, and the importance of really delivering a service that was respectful to women and to all customers. I remember having a conversation with one of the drivers, and he was emphasizing how he thought that there was a huge lack of communication between drivers and between drivers of different associations, which in turn is kind of a manifestation of sort of the tension and the violence that there is between these associations, but also a comment that he made about the huge potential that the minibus taxi industry has in terms of earning for the workers and the people that work within the sector, particularly at a time where other forms of transport are pretty much at a standstill in Cape Town. And so this sort of willingness and understanding of if we can make the service better, if we can make our customers feel safer and more willing to actually make use of our service, it will not benefit just them, but also us as an industry. And so I just found that was quite interesting, that came out of some conversations that started from consent and sexual harassment and mutual respect, etc. So I think, yeah, very, very varied response, but also quite evolving as we were continuing to deliver the activities. And I was quite impressed, and I thought it was quite positive overall.
Thank you for sharing that insight, Shelley. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. Right, we have only a few minutes left, so probably time for just a couple more questions. The next one I'm going to go with is, were you able to work with trade unions in any of the cities to promote women's employment in transport? And the simple answer to that is absolutely. Certainly from TransAid's perspective, transport associations, transport unions are actually absolutely key stakeholders in this sort of area of work. So we make that a priority to develop those relationships. As you'll have heard from the Cape Town presentation, SANTACO, the South African National Taxi Council, which is an association of smaller minibus taxi associations, it was an absolute key part of this. And going forward, if we achieve our aim of scaling that up, will actually play a key role in promoting women's employment within the industry. Likewise in Tunis, and particularly in Abuja, actually, the 2- and 3-wheeler associations, very close links there. I think what we often find is obviously they play a key role in communicating with their members and supporting that sort of transition to bringing more women into the industry. But also what we generally find, there are sort of skills gaps within the associations, within the unions themselves, in terms of the ability to support women in the workplace, particularly in workplaces which are male dominated. So that's something we actually work on in Uganda. We're working with a couple of the unions there to build their ability to support women in the workplace. So absolutely, in short, is the answer to that. And final question for now, I think, will be, let's go to you, Emma. It's a Tunis one. Great findings from the various countries and wonderful presentations. I'm curious to know if there were cases of harassment from fellow women. And I say there's no reference to Tunisia here, but I know sexual harassment, verbal, physical, was right at the top of the list in terms of priorities for women there. So it makes sense maybe to talk a bit about Tunis in this respect. Over to you.
Thank you for the question. There wasn't so much harassment from women, woman-on-woman harassment, but what was quite interesting was we had a number of respondents who talked about when they were harassed on a bus or a train, other women were not particularly solidaristic with them. The particularly older women would say, stop making a fuss, keep quiet, older women might be more critical of the way that younger women dressed and suggested that they were inviting, unpleasant attention. So there was quite a sort of a strong social pressure for women to just try and downplay this at each other's expense and not necessarily be supportive of women who complained about harassment. But on the other hand, to counter that, there were quite a lot of efforts by women to show solidarity. So women who would try and set up informal carpooling networks, women who would try and campaign against, there's a women's organization, Khadif, which had done a large campaign on public transport, harassers will not travel with us, trying to recruit women, to mobilize women, to be vocal about their rejection of harassment and to report harassment more often. So there's both sides of the coin in all of that. I think, does that answer the question?
I'll accept that answer, Emma. Thank you. Brilliant. We are coming to the end now. I'd lastly just like to say thank you to the project team who presented today. I'd also like to say thank you to everybody for attending. As I mentioned before, we'll be sharing a recording of the webinar, we'll be sharing the slides, and we'll be sharing a few resources as well to everybody that registered. And please, if you want to contact us, our emails are on the screen there. Visit our website. And finally, also the questions we didn't have the time to get to today, we've got a record of them, and we'll be contacting you individually with a response to those. But thank you again, everybody, and hopefully see you next time.